So the process with Mary was a pretty fun process. Usually when we get started with coming up with ideas with mazes, we generally go through a pitching process, and it's a phase that we usually do the year before the event starts. And with like all our mazes, we have a number of different concepts and ideas, and they're usually just like one-page concepts. And we um, Mary ended up actually being a pitch that I presented over to our team, our leadership team, a few years ago. And when we make the decisions of choosing a maze, there's so many factors that go into it. A good example would be, there may be a certain venue throughout the park that might be better suited for, the concept. And so, along with that type of, thought that goes into it, it took us a couple of years and with some refinements, and, I presented it over to our team, and, we immediately started designing the maze for its current location. So it's a bit of a fun process because there's a handful of us in the creative studio in which I work at, mainly our show directors, our writers, our fellow designers that put together these ideas. That then just gets presented amongst our group, and they hand select a handful of them that go through a certain selection process, and then it winds down to the one or two that we end up selecting for the year. So it's pretty fun process. For Mary, I think the main reason, there's a few reasons why we wanted to do Mary. We wanted, well, of course, there's we have the opportunity to look at certain IPs. Like over the years, we've done different types of movies. We've done The Grudge. We've done Quarantine. These are really popular horror movies when they came out. But what we've done before in the past, or what we've done recently, is we all do our own original IPs, our original concepts. And why I wanted to do Mary is because I think it just, for me, it resonated with something that I think for a lot of people, we've had our interpretations and our own different experiences and our different introductions into the Mary lore, and they're all very different. And for Mary, for me, it was something that was very personal because I think as I grew up, I've heard different stories, but I think the way it stuck with me throughout the years almost kind of sort of ended up being kind of almost like a little fun but timeless kind of fear that you think about, that I think for me it sort of crossed a lot of boundaries, and I think I thought that it would interest a lot of other people just because of the different stories. I think the biggest thing that really resonated with me was that it sort of, the lore itself that revolves around Bloody Mary crosses a lot of different cultures and different communities. And for myself, I have family in the Philippines and family in Hawaii that are, two different cultures, but, they each had a similar folklore or story that revolved around a character like Mary. And after talking to friends here at work and just friends, my friends outside of work, they also, growing up in other parts of, throughout the place, throughout the world and just in our different communities, still had that through line similarity about saying her name 3 times while looking in a mirror. And so, I thought that it was something that resonated just across the board around different folks. And the fact that when I heard it as I was growing up and my kids are now hearing it with their friends, it's definitely something that seems to be very, very popular, or just a lore that kind of like how Exorcist, the movie, sort of, at least for me, imprinted on me in terms of, the moment I could clearly remember when I first saw the trailer as a kid growing up of The Exorcist and how much that really struck a chord. And so I'll never forget that moment. Very much the way I feel about how Mary is to a lot of other folks who still remember it fondly when they first were introduced to it. So it was definitely something that I thought would be a good opportunity to put a twist on with our current not very farm lore. Um, we do a lot of world building here, which is probably the funnest part of my job, where we get an opportunity to kind of sort of take our theme that we have here at the park that we've been sticking to for decades and sort of build a universe around it, not only like directly in terms of how she affects like some of the things outside of just the maze, but more indirectly in the form of like Easter eggs and things that we could kind of sort of build our lore around as we move forward with some of our original IPs that we create. Well, when we're putting together a maze, we try to sort of approach it almost like we're telling a story or a very short story, and so we develop these scenes almost like story beats, if you would, to kind of sort of tell this story that sends guests down a journey of what we're trying to convey. Not only are we trying to scare the heck out of them, but we're also at the same time, I think, trying to present our story in a way that the guest will not only be entertained, but they could kind of sort of follow with it. And in the sense of Mary, because she has such a tie into in just most of the lore with the idea of having to look into a mirror and saying her name 3 times, we definitely use that. And for each of the scenes of Mary, we sort of take guests through a little journey of her appearing not only in the mirrors, but sort of breaking through these mirrors in the form of like apparitions or actual, scare actors coming out as Mary through these mirrors, huge monstrosities and animatronics kind of sort of emerging out of her, like basically her popping out trying to attack a guest, or maybe there's a little vignette or a little scene that's happening. And so we definitely try to use that. And then in the maze itself, we sort of take guests through this journey inside of her home, in which, in the story, she was originally murdered in. And so as guests return back to this home, which has now been, over the years, transformed into a group home for disenfranchised teenagers throughout the years, we sort of see and pick up the story of her coming back and looking at her house being invaded by these folks. I mean, it's the same house, it's the same, it's got the same structure, it's got the same wallpaper that she had, that she and her husband put up, but there's different faces, different smiles, different laughter, and so there's a bit of a feeling of invasion that she feels while she's searching for her family. So, we use that sort of as a backdrop to where we have the use of these mirrors and her staring out of, and then it sort of crescendos into almost this point where the guests are now seeing where she's been trapped throughout the years, and we have a big huge play off of her emerging out of this big huge mirror, and we see the monstrous version of her and trying to keep guests from escaping her home, for invading it and all sorts of stuff. So it's kind of a cool use of and sort of a through line narrative that we use with the use of Mary, with the use of mirrors in our story. So it's pretty fun. Definitely pretty fun. I hope that guests get a chance to check it out this season, and I think they'll have a lot of fun. But yeah, thank you so much for having me.